Forget the stained glass windows for a second. Forget the glowing halos, the perfect robes, and the serene, peaceful expressions you see in classical museum art. If you were going to build a team to launch a global movement that would alter the course of human history forever, you probably wouldn't pick these guys. The 12 disciples of Jesus weren't elite scholars, wealthy politicians, or religious heavyweights. They were a completely ragtag, mismatched group of absolute nobodies. We are talking about blue-collar labourers, social outcasts, violent political radicals, and guys who literally could not stop arguing with each other. They were flawed, they were deeply human, and frankly, some of them hated each other's guts right out of the gate. Yet this chaotic dozen sparked a revolution that is still burning over 2,000 years later. How does that even happen? Who were these men really before the titles and the statues? Today we are tearing down the myths, We are going to look at the actual, raw, unfiltered profiles of every single disciple of Jesus. We have to start with the core of the group, the inner circle. When Jesus began his ministry, he didn't head to the Ivy League academies of Jerusalem to find his right-hand men. He went straight to the Sea of Galilee. Now, this wasn't a scenic vacation spot. It was a gritty, working-class industrial hub for the fishing trade. Fishing back then wasn't sitting on a dock with a cold drink on a Sunday afternoon. It was brutal, physically agonising work. You smelled like fish. You worked all night. You fought sudden storms that could capsize your boat and drown you in seconds. And you paid heavy, oppressive taxes to the Roman Empire on everything you managed to catch. This is where Jesus found his first recruits. 4 rugged, weather-beaten fishermen who would become the absolute foundation of his entire operation. Let's talk about the loudest guy in the room. Simon, who Jesus famously renamed Peter, meaning the rock. Peter is the unofficial leader of the group, and if we are being completely honest, he is the patron saint of speaking before you think. Peter is the guy who is always at a level 10. He is passionate, fiercely loyal, but incredibly impulsive. If there is a wrong thing to say at the wrong time, Peter is almost guaranteed to say it. He is the guy who literally jumps out of a perfectly good boat in the middle of a raging storm just to walk on water, only to realise what he is doing, halfway there, panic, and start drowning. He is the guy who pulls a sword and chops off a guard's ear when the authorities come to arrest Jesus in the middle of the night. But here is the tragic, relatable beauty of Peter. His loud bravado was often a mask for his own frailty. When the pressure hit its absolute peak, and Jesus was on trial for his life, this fearless sword-swinging leader caved. He denied even knowing Jesus 3 separate times just to save his own skin. He failed spectacularly and publicly. But the reason Peter is so crucial to history is that he didn't stay down. His story is the ultimate comeback. He transformed from a boastful, terrified fisherman into a bold, immovable leader who eventually requested to be crucified upside down because he didn't feel worthy of dying the exact same way his master did. Peter is the living proof that you don't have to be perfect to be used for something massive. Right next to Peter, but usually standing quietly in his shadow, is his brother, Andrew. Now imagine being Peter's brother. It has to be exhausting. Peter sucks all the oxygen out of every single room he walks into. But Andrew is fascinating because he is the exact opposite. If Peter is the microphone, Andrew is the cables running behind the stage. He is the ultimate connector. A lot of people don't know this, but Andrew actually met Jesus first. But instead of keeping the spotlight for himself, the very first thing he does is run and get his loudmouth brother, Peter, and bring him to Jesus. Andrew is the master of networking. He didn't need to be the main character. In the famous story where Jesus feeds 5,000 people, everyone is panicking about where to get food and doing the math on how impossible it is. It's Andrew who quietly notices a little boy in the massive crowd with a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish, and brings him forward. He is a behind-the-scenes guy, a bridge builder who noticed the individuals in a sea of faces. Without Andrew's quiet, ego-free introductions, the early movement wouldn't have had its loudest voices. Then we have the other two fishermen of the inner circle, brothers James and John. Jesus gave them a nickname that tells you absolutely everything you need to know about their personalities. He called them Boanerges, which translates to the sons of thunder. These guys were not mild-mannered introverts. They were intense, wildly ambitious, and had tempers that could flare up in a millisecond. In one story, they are travelling through a Samaritan village that disrespects Jesus and refuses to give them shelter. James and John don't just suggest moving on to the next town. They literally ask Jesus if they should call down fire from heaven to incinerate the entire village. Just a totally nuclear 0 to 60 overreaction. They were also brutally competitive. At one point, they actually got their mother to go to Jesus and ask if her two boys could sit on thrones right next to him in his kingdom, which completely infuriated the other 10 disciples. They wanted the glory, the power, and the prime VIP seats. But the trajectory of the Sons of Thunder is a study in massive contrasts. Their intense, fiery passion was eventually channeled into something entirely different. James became the very first of the 12 disciples to be executed for his faith, killed by the sword of King Herod. He was the first to pay the ultimate price. His brother John, however, went the exact opposite route. John became the longest surviving disciple. He was the only one who didn't die a violent martyr's death. He lived to be a very old man, eventually exiled to a brutal prison island called Patmos, where he had the visions that became the Book of Revelation. The fiery, hot-headed young men who wanted to burn down villages grew up to write some of the most profound texts about love, grace, and endurance in human history. So if the fishermen were the loud, impulsive core of the group, the next two guys make up the most dangerous political powder keg you could possibly imagine. If you were a PR manager trying to put together a cohesive team, you would never in a million years put Matthew and Simon the Zealot in the same room. Let's start with Matthew, who also went by the name Levi. Matthew was a tax collector, and to understand who he was, you have to understand how much tax collectors were hated in first century Judea. They weren't just seen as annoying IRS agents, they were considered literal traitors. Rome occupied the Jewish land with a brutal military presence, and they outsourced their tax collection to local Jewish citizens. The Romans would set a quota, and the tax collector was given the military backing to squeeze whatever they wanted out of the people on top of that quota. Whatever extra they collected, they kept. It was a legalised, state-sponsored mafia shakedown. Because of this, Matthew was incredibly wealthy, but he was universally despised. He was excommunicated from the synagogue, completely cut off from his community, and lumped into a social category, with prostitutes and the worst kind of sinners. When Jesus walked right up to Matthew's toll booth in the middle of the city and said, "Follow me," it was a massive relationship-destroying public scandal. But then you have Simon the Zealot. If Matthew was a wealthy sellout working for the Roman Empire, Simon was an absolute anti-Roman radical. The Zealots weren't just people who were really enthusiastic about their faith, they were a hyper-nationalist, extremist political faction. They believed that paying taxes to Rome was a direct insult to God, and they were entirely willing to use violence, assassination, and armed rebellion to force the Romans out of their country. Their primary targets weren't just Roman soldiers, they specifically targeted Jewish collaborators, people exactly like Matthew. Just stop and think about the absolute insanity of this dynamic. Jesus recruited a man who extorted his own people for the oppressive government, and then he turned around and recruited a man whose sworn political duty was to murder government collaborators. And he put them in the same small group. He made them travel together, eat together, and sleep by the same campfires for 3 years. Simon probably had to check his daggers at the door, and Matthew probably slept with one eye open. It's the ultimate proof that the movement Jesus was building wasn't about political alignment. It was about tearing down the deepest, most toxic, blood-sworn divisions imaginable. If a radical zealot and a corrupt tax collector could sit at the same table, share a meal, and eventually call each other brothers, literally anything was possible. But the group wasn't just made up of hotheads and political rivals. Every startup, every movement needs its pragmatists. You need the guys who look at a massive, impossible vision and ask, okay, but how are we actually going to pay for this? That brings us to the realists of the group, Philip and Thomas. Philip is basically the logistics manager of the disciples. He is the guy who constantly runs the numbers. In the famous story where a massive crowd of 5,000 people is starving, Jesus turns directly to Philip and asks him where they can buy bread. The text actually says Jesus was testing him, and Philip instantly fails the test because he goes straight to his mental spreadsheet. He doesn't think about the possibility of a miracle. He calculates the budget. He blurts out, 8 months of wages wouldn't buy enough bread for each of these people to have a single bite. Philip is pragmatic to a fault. He is a concrete thinker. Later on, during the Last Supper, when Jesus is giving a profound, deeply spiritual and abstract farewell speech, Philip interrupts and says, Lord, just show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. He doesn't want metaphors, he wants a visual presentation. He wants the bottom line. And speaking of wanting proof, we have to talk about Thomas. History has been incredibly unfair to Thomas. We literally slapped him with the nickname Doubting Thomas. And for 2,000 years, he has been the global poster child for weak faith and cynicism. But if you actually look at the historical texts, Thomas wasn't a cynic. He was just a realist who refused to fake it. Earlier in their travels, when Jesus decided to go back to Judea, a region where a mob had just tried to stone him to death, the other disciples were terrified and tried to talk him out of it. But it was Thomas who looked at the group and said, Let us also go, that we may die with him. That is not the voice of a coward. That is grim, fatalistic loyalty. He is basically saying, this is a suicide mission. The math doesn't look good, but we are going anyway. Fast forward to after the crucifixion. Thomas wasn't in the room when Jesus allegedly first reappeared to the other disciples. When they told him Jesus was alive, Thomas essentially said, I know what I saw. I saw him executed by professional Roman killers. Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were, I will not believe it. We call that doubt, but honestly, that's just rational human logic. He wanted the exact same proof the other 10 guys had already received. He wasn't going to build his entire life on hearsay. And when he finally got that proof, Thomas didn't hold back. He dropped to his knees and made the most definitive, bold declaration of anyone in the entire narrative, looking at Jesus and saying, My Lord and my God. And Thomas took that conviction further than almost anyone else. Historical tradition tells us that this so-called doubter travelled thousands of miles outside the safety of the Roman Empire, taking the message all the way to India, where he was eventually pierced through with a spear for his faith. Not bad for a guy remembered only for his skepticism. Every great ensemble cast has its background characters. When you look at the list of the 12 disciples, you have the heavy hitters, the loudmouths, and the controversial figures. But then you have a handful of guys who barely get any screen time in the historical accounts. But these obscure disciples are just as crucial to understanding the reality of this group. Let's look at Bartholomew, who is widely believed to be the same person as Nathaniel. If we had to give Bartholomew a defining trait, it would be that he was brutally honest and completely lacked a filter. When his friend Philip first comes running to him, absolutely thrilled, saying they have found the Messiah and that he is a carpenter from a town called Nazareth, Bartholomew doesn't share the excitement. Instead, he drops one of the most famously sarcastic lines in the entire text. He looks at Philip and says, Nazareth, can anything good come from there? It was the 1st century equivalent of absolute regional snobbery. Nazareth was a tiny, backwater, nothing town. Bartholomew was sceptical, cynical, and highly prejudiced. But what makes his story brilliant is how Jesus responds. When Jesus meets this sarcastic skeptic, he doesn't scold him for his attitude. He actually praises him basically saying, here is a guy who is completely authentic and doesn't fake anything. Bartholomew's raw, unfiltered honesty wasn't a disqualifier. It was exactly the kind of genuine character Jesus was looking for. Then you have James the Lesser. Just stop and imagine being so entirely overshadowed in your own friend group that history literally remembers you as the Lesser, sometimes translated as James the Younger or James the Short. This nickname was purely practical, given just to distinguish him from the louder, more famous James, the son of thunder. We know almost nothing about James the Lesser. He didn't write a book. He didn't give any monumental speeches. He didn't have any massive, heroic failures or dramatic comebacks recorded. He was just there. And in a way, James the Lesser represents the vast majority of people in any movement. He is the ultimate unsung hero, the guy who simply shows up, does the work, stays loyal, and doesn't need his name in lights to remain committed to the cause. Alongside him is Jude, also known as Thaddeus. Jude's biggest problem historically is his actual name, Judas. He is often referred to as Judas, not Iscariot, which basically means he spent his entire historical legacy being explicitly separated from the most hated man in human history. Jude has only one recorded line in the entire narrative. During the Last Supper, he raises his hand and asks Jesus a very logical question. Lord, why do you intend to show yourself to us and not to the world? Jude couldn't understand the strategy. In his mind, if you are starting a revolution, you need a massive public relations campaign. You need to go to Rome, go to the emperor, and put on a show. He was baffled by the quiet, grassroots, under-the-radar approach Jesus was taking. But talking about the name Judas inevitably brings us to the darkest, most complex and most tragic figure of the entire group, Judas Iscariot. For 2,000 years, Judas has been portrayed as a cartoon villain, a one-dimensional monster who was pure evil from day one. But the reality is far more chilling. You have to remember that Jesus chose Judas. Judas was trusted. In fact, he was trusted so much that he was made the treasurer of the group. He literally held the money bag for the entire operation. You don't give the company bank account to the guy sitting in the corner twirling a villain moustache. Judas was likely incredibly competent, organised and deeply respected by the other 11 disciples. So why did he do it? Why did he commit the ultimate betrayal? Historians and theologians point to a lethal combination of political disillusionment and deep-seated greed. Geographically, Judas Iscariot was likely the only disciple from Judea, the southern region, while the other 11 were rough working-class Galileans from the north. He might have always felt like a bit of an outsider. But more importantly, Judas, like many others, was likely expecting a military conqueror. He wanted a Messiah who would ride a warhorse into Jerusalem, slaughter the Roman legions, and establish a wealthy, powerful earthly kingdom. A kingdom where the guy holding the money bag would suddenly become the secretary of the treasury. But over 3 years, Judas watched Jesus reject political power again and again. He watched him preach about loving enemies, turning the other cheek, and dying a servant's death. The disillusionment must have been a slow, toxic burn. Judas realised he had invested 3 years into a startup that was actively refusing to go public. Combine that shattered political ambition with outright greed. The texts tell us that Judas had been quietly skimming off the top of the group's funds for a while. The breaking point finally came when he went to the religious authorities and struck a deal to hand Jesus over. The price, 30 pieces of silver. It wasn't a king's ransom. In the ancient world, 30 pieces of silver was the exact legally prescribed compensation for a dead slave. It was an insulting, degrading amount of money. Judas betrayed his friend, his rabbi, and his leader with a kiss in a dark garden. The ultimate gesture of intimacy weaponized into an act of lethal treachery. But the tragedy of Judas is that the money didn't bring him the satisfaction he craved. When he saw that Jesus was actually condemned to die, the weight of his actions crushed him. The guilt was so absolute, so suffocating, that he threw the blood money back onto the temple floor and tragically ended his own life. He is the ultimate cautionary tale of how unchecked ambition and greed can completely destroy a person from the inside out. The death of Judas left a glaring hole in the group. They were down to 11. But in the Jewish mindset, numbers meant everything. Jesus specifically chose 12 disciples to mirror the 12 tribes of Israel, symbolizing a complete restoration of God's people. 11 just wouldn't work, so before they could officially launch their movement to the world, they had to fill the vacancy. They gathered in a room and established strict criteria. The replacement had to be someone who had been with them from the very beginning, from the baptism of Jesus all the way to his resurrection. They narrowed it down to 2 highly qualified candidates, a man named Justus and Matthias. What they did next seems absolutely wild to our modern sensibilities. They didn't hold a debate, they didn't vote, they prayed, and then they literally cast lots. They rolled the ancient equivalent of dice to make the final decision, trusting that God would guide the outcome. The lot fell to Matthias. Just like that, he was drafted into the most famous inner circle in history. And the most fascinating part about Matthias? After winning this epic divine lottery to become the 12th disciple, he is never explicitly mentioned by name again in the historical text. He stepped up, filled the gap, did the work, and faded perfectly into the massive, sweeping history of the movement. If we are going to be completely honest about the 12 disciples, we have to look at how their story almost ended. It almost ended in total, humiliating failure. On a Thursday night, they are sitting around a table, pounding their chests, swearing absolute ride-or-die loyalty to Jesus. Less than 24 hours later, the entire group has completely shattered. When the temple guards and Roman soldiers showed up in the dark, the bravado vanished. They ran. When Jesus was hanging on a Roman cross dying an agonizing death out of the inner circle, only John was there. The rest had scattered like terrified sheep. They locked themselves in a dark room, jumping at every footstep outside the door, absolutely convinced that the Roman death squads were coming for them next. They were broken, they were cowardly, and the grand revolution they thought they were leading had apparently ended in blood and absolute defeat. If the story stopped right there, you and I wouldn't be talking about them today. They would be a forgotten, irrelevant footnote in the massive archives of ancient Roman history. But something happened, something so explosive, so undeniably real, that it completely rewired the psychology of these men almost overnight. They claimed Jesus walked out of his own grave. Now, you don't have to share their religious beliefs to acknowledge the staggering historical reality of their psychological shift. These guys went from cowering behind locked doors in sheer terror to standing in the exact same city streets where their leader was just executed. They looked the exact same religious and political authorities dead in the eye, and they started preaching with absolutely zero fear. The ultimate proof of their radical transformation is how their stories ended. This wasn't a grift. Launching this movement didn't get them rich. They didn't get mansions, political power, book deals, or comfortable retirements. They got executed. Peter was crucified upside down in Rome. Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross in Greece. James was beheaded by the king. Thomas was run through with a spear in India. Bartholomew was allegedly flayed alive. Matthew was killed by a halberd in Ethiopia. Out of the core group, only John died of old age, and that was only after surviving brutal exile and imprisonment on a desolate rock in the Mediterranean. Here is the historical bottom line. People will absolutely die for a lie if they genuinely believe it is the truth. But nobody willingly dies a horrific, torturous death for a lie they made up themselves. When given the chance to recant, to save their own lives by simply admitting the resurrection was a hoax, every single one of them doubled down. They looked death in the face and essentially said, "Do your worst. We know exactly what we saw." When you look at the 12 disciples as a whole, The most shocking thing isn't their perfection, it is their absolute lack of it. They were hotheads, doubters, obscure nobodies, political extremists, and social outcasts. They argued constantly about who was the greatest. They misunderstood the mission almost daily, and when the stakes were highest, their initial reaction was to run for their lives. But that is exactly the point. The movement that ultimately shaped the course of human history wasn't built on the shoulders of untouchable, flawless elite superheroes. It was built on deeply flawed, incredibly ordinary people who were completely transformed by an extraordinary encounter. Their legacy is the ultimate proof that you don't need the perfect resume, the perfect past, or a flawless character to leave a massive impact on the world. You just need to be willing to show up, allow yourself to be changed, and stand immovable when it matters most. Thanks for watching. If you want more deep dives into the real, unfiltered stories behind history's biggest moments, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.